to celebrate and the contributions that you, our communities, staff, and commissioners make to the Planning Commission. So just want to take a moment and have staff stand up and say hello. If staff could stand up, just so we can say hello. And then I'd also like to recognize our executive committee members. If we could have our executive committee members stand up. Thank you. If you have any commissioners, yeah, we have several other commissioners here. So in the past, we would have our business meeting here now, but we've decided to, since COVID, do that separately. So we already did that last week. So we will spare you all to talk about our annual budget and good things like that, so we can get to the good parts here this afternoon. First, we want to take a moment to remember one of our former commissioners. So Colin is going to come up and share a few words.
Hello, everyone. I have the honor of presenting some remembrances of Marcia Gassis that I talked to a few of her friends and colleagues. She passed away peacefully on February 20th at her home with her family by her side. She was born in Dover, and she was a dedicated public servant with a level of professionalism and empathy that will be sorely missed in the region. She was ingrained in her community, with a consistent presence on many boards for the city of Dover, sometimes concurrently, but she was always able to be conscientious of conflict and maintain an independent voice. She was on the Dover Planning Board chair for many years until she took a job with the city of Rochester, and then eventually became the planner in Barrington. Chris Parker is one of the people I talked to, and he remembered Marcia as being head and shoulders above the other candidates when she applied to be the town planner in Barrington. She took great pride in her work. It was very clear, and she always smiled and helped everyone that came in the door there. Chris also remembered Marcia telling him that she was a farmer's daughter who knew how to speak to the city dweller and the suburban mom. She was able to apply her many roles in her life. Working with her ex-husband, she appreciated industry. Working with the Conservation Commission, she appreciated the environment and the need to protect and balance both. She was level-headed, and while she could be emotional, she knew that to react with emotion didn't serve the community in the long term and what needed to be achieved. As a city councilor, Marcia represented Dover at SRPC meetings. We could always count on her level-headed assessment or a valuable contrary point of view. I often remember her compelling committee members to look at an issue from another's point of view. Marcia was very dedicated to her children, and she spent much of their childhood traveling New England for sports events and recreation trips. She got to spend precious time with her grandson Garrett, who often accompanied her to SRPC meetings. It was heartwarming to see her with him at the meetings because her love for him was palpable. Marcia enjoyed her final years at her camp in Freedom with her partner Peter and their two dogs, Ginger and Beatrice.
Thank you, Colin. Next, I'd like to call up Angie Cleveland, who is one of SRPC's newest staff members. Angie joins us as a senior regional planner, focusing mostly on economic development, but some other fun projects as well. So Angie's going to introduce our panelists for this afternoon and thank you. All right, Rachel, do we need to make any more changes? Share the screen.
Sorry, I'm not used to the screen option, which is what we have in front of us today. Perfect. Oh, we're not seeing it. We did try this out, I promise, right before. All right. So thank you so much for being here today. I'm going to introduce our panel in a couple minutes after we go through what the agenda is going to look like, so you can get a better idea of what we're going to talk about today. So we have 3 great presentations. These planners, all planners and staff from all different perspectives, local, regional, and state, are going to share their experiences with planning, share some of the expertise that they have gathered over the years, and then answer some questions. So we have some questions already slated for them, but we'd love for you all to also ask them some questions. So we left about 20 minutes towards the end of this session, which were maybe, like 80 to 90 minutes, we'll see how it goes. But each of them do have their own PowerPoint. But I do want to introduce all of them because I believe that you should get to know these folks as well as possible. So, excuse me, first we'll have Shanna Saunders, who is the planning director for the city of Rochester. Shanna is a graduate of the Resource Administration and Management Master's Degree Program at UNH and has an undergraduate degree in environmental conservation, also from UNH. After a stint working across state lines in Raleigh, Massachusetts, she moved her talents to the state she lived in and loved. She worked for the past 20 years in several communities across New Hampshire, including Laconia, Somersworth, and Rochester. So she's been in the region for a while. She continues to strive every day to integrate wise land use principles into New Hampshire land use policies. Next, we have Sherrie Trefry, who is the energy market leader at DHB. She is also works at an environmental and engineering consultancy with in their office in Bedford. She has worked as an environmental scientist and permitting specialist in New Hampshire for 19 years. She is a certified soil scientist here in the state and in Maine, and has served as the president of the New Hampshire Association for Natural Resource Scientists and the Society of Soil Scientists in Northern New England. So another leader like Shanna, who's also volunteered her time for our professional associations. Sherrie is a board member of Clean Energy New Hampshire and a partner in the New England Coalition for Offshore Wind. Her practice is focused on upgrading the existing transmission grid and incorporating renewables for a sustainable future. And we'll wrap it up today with Josh Elliott, the director of the Division of Policy and Programs from New Hampshire Department of Energy. He is responsible, or his division is, I'm sure, under your leadership, is responsible for a variety of assistance programs, sustainable energy programs, as well as the new federal funds made available from the bill and IRA. He's also tasked with drafting and updating the state's energy strategy. In addition to his work at the department, Josh serves as the governor's designee on the Drinking Water Groundwater Trust Fund Advisory Committee. That is the longest name ever. And as a member on the Bureau of Energy Management's Gulf of Maine Intergovernmental Renewable Energy Task Force. So 2 big ones.
It's government.
Absolutely. And with that, I'm going to invite all 3 panelists to come up here, and I'm going to actually give you the mic for your presentations today. So we'll start with Shanna.
Wonderful. All right, thanks for having me. I'm Shanna from the city of Rochester. So it's great to be here today to talk a little bit about what we're doing in Rochester for solar. And so I wanted to start by giving a little bit of where we are in Rochester. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to be talking about solar ordinance that we just adopted in the last 6 months or so. So over the past couple of years, we have started to see a lot of solar permits. So in Rochester, just permits that have come in, building permits, we had almost 225 of them. And you can see that for the most part, those have been roof mount systems. And this is both, the 225 is both commercial and residential. But we started to kind of see a movement to other types of installations. The roof type installations, very benign, very kind of out of sight, out of mind. Especially in some of the commercial buildings that have a flat roof, you're not even sure that they're there. But in Rochester, we've started to see different types of installations, larger ground mount installations, and then the solar trackers, which if folks are familiar with Rochester and know the Staples, that's right off the highway, they're familiar with what those trackers look like. And so there was a lot of kind of, discussion amongst kind of the city leadership about, the fact that in Rochester, we didn't necessarily regulate solar. And we had a lot of these proposals coming forward. And in fact, larger and larger scale proposals too. So again, going back to that Staples property, if folks are familiar, the first couple of trackers went in probably almost 6, 7 years ago. Then they added a couple more, then they added a couple more. You probably don't see it, but there's a ton of roof solar on there. And so we started kind of pondering about where the scale of solar might be going, especially in a community where we didn't necessarily have regulations. So I do want to recognize Ryan O'Connor, who's my senior planner. He's here as well. He did a lot of the legwork on putting together the solar ordinance. I am going to kind of broad brush it, but if folks did have specific questions, certainly catch myself or Ryan afterward, and we can answer that. The way that we decided to kind of move forward with our ordinance in Rochester is to really break it into two main categories. So accessory solar, which is folks that are coming forward, they have an electric bill they pay every month, they understand that by putting in solar panels that can help alleviate that electric cost that they have. And that was probably 90% of what we saw coming forward in Rochester. And then primary solar. And so, there were a few folks that once they put in their solar and realized kind of, oh, the payback was a lot quicker than we expected. Oh, and I have a lot more room on my lot. Maybe I can put a few more panels and a few more panels and a few more panels. And really making it a primary use of a commercial lot. As opposed to accessory to just help pay bills. And all of a sudden, kind of the whole dynamic of a commercial lot could change. And so, next slide, please. In talking with some of the solar installers, the way that we moved forward was by size. And so we broke out size into a number of different categories across both accessory, and then we'll get into primary, to basically say, look, if you are kind of a small scale accessory, industrial, commercial, and we understand that a commercial accessory is going to be a lot bigger than just a residential accessory, right? So we have industrial business in the community that has probably one of the biggest installs, solar installs that we have, but they, for the most part, all of that electricity is being used on site. It would probably serve an entire residential neighborhood, but it was still accessory. They were still using it all on site. So we broke it off by size. And for the most part, for accessory, we made sure that it was a permitted use across the board. And I'll get into, actually, next slide, I think it's in the later. And so we did, in some of these accessory uses, because there was a lot of concern, we did see some of these larger scale ground mounts being used as accessory in residential neighborhoods. We did, although we made it permitted in all zones, we did, and in some of those added by conditional use permit or by special exception. So if you're going to have maybe a larger scale, kind of more obtrusive, you have a very small lot, accessory solar install, we may have you go to a conditional use permit. It's still permitted, it's a permitted use in that zone, but we're going to have you go before the planning board to just take a look and make sure you're not going to have an impact on the neighbors. And then we did put in, into those regulations, some additional, design requirements, like the height setbacks from your neighbor's property lines. If you do have certain types of installs, that they be screened, so your neighbor's not necessarily looking at that from their front yard. And then stormwater considerations as well, because stormwater was oft talked about, as far as, kind of what sort of impact these might have on stormwater. And we really wanted to codify that it really was a minimal impact. Because I think a lot of times folks would come in and bring to the table some concerns about stormwater that weren't necessarily playing out in the field, and so we wanted to codify that. So then we moved on to the primary use, and so these are the larger installs. These are installations that maybe started off as a different commercial business, but they realized that by installing solar, they really could be putting back to the grid, quite a bit more than what they were using on site. Or we have had a couple of commercial entities contact us about using the entire site as a solar site as their commercial business. And so this was really, what we did was we worked with some of the installers, and we worked within the confines of the new state statute that's out there to make sure that we could blend as best we could with the other language, the other regulatory language that was out there. And so we did break it up into 3 different categories of primary use, and again, by size, so that it was very clear to the reviewers, to the planning board members, to the members of the public that may come in as abutters, what they were dealing with the solar. And because we could ask the proposer to put together exactly what size system they were going to install. And so, with this one, there was quite a bit of concern as we kind of drafted this with both the planning board and the city council about the impacts of these systems aesthetically. If we were to allow these across all commercial districts, we have several mixed use districts where there's residential and commercial allowed on the same lot or allowed in the same area. And so it is permitted, again, it's a permitted use, but in almost all cases, these commercial installations, primary use commercial installations do need to go to the planning board for review. And they just need to meet criteria such as, will not decrease property values, will not put an undue burden on city services, discussion about proper infrastructure being in place. It allows the fire department to take a look and make sure that they have access in case of any emergencies and things like that. And then we tried to make some of the design requirements very similar so that it was very, very easy to review, very easy to comprehend, of whether you were accessory or primary. So a lot of the same visibility, stormwater, EMS response. Vegetation management was an issue we didn't expect to come up, but we have seen come up with some of these larger installs, because of course, if your business, the primary input for your business is the sun, then how tall all of that, all those street trees are and landscaping that is put in, it really affects that. And so vegetation management was something that we had to work with the developers to kind of come up with a scheme that works for everyone. And then the noise. So you don't think of solar as having noise, you think of it as very passive, but these new systems are being designed as what are called tracker systems, and they follow the sun. And so they do have small hydraulic motors. And when you have 50 of them, 50 small hydraulic motors all turning these solar trackers to try and get the brightest spot, there's a little bit of a noise effect from that, and so we did need to address that as well. So a couple of the things that came up as issues that were kind of surprising as we went through kind of our design process with this ordinance, and let me tell you that what we did is, and kind of what I think is fairly typical in an ordinance design, that you go and you take a look at what surrounding communities are doing, like what do other folks have on their books. We did find not a lot of solar ordinances, so we didn't have a lot of examples, and for the most part, the solar ordinances that we did see were fairly new, and so it wasn't easy for us to say, oh, this has been in place for 15 years, we know the language in this really works. And then we did reach out to some state folks and we talked to some installers. We actually had Sherrie at her firm take a look at it and review it for legal reasons. But even with all that prep and all that review, when it comes for discussion, when you get your leadership involved, when you get your public involved, with the butters, those stakeholders, other issues come up. So in residential areas, one of the big issues that came up was the perception that property values were going to be an issue. So if my neighbor puts in a big solar install in his backyard, it's going to make my property values go down, and I need to be protected from that. And so there was some education there that we had to do, and there was some compromise there that we had to do. On the other card, on the opposite side of that concern, right, were the leadership members that were like, why are you trying to regulate what I want to do with my house? If I want to put solar panels on my house to save my electric bill, why are you putting that into ordinance? And so we had to walk that fine line between, please regulate my neighbor and make sure that there's no noise and it's 100% screened and I don't have to deal with it at all, with why are we putting any regulations in place that all on this, we should just let our neighbors do whatever we want. So that was definitely a fine line to walk. And then the other thing that came up that I'm not sure we still have the answer to, because we're just really not there yet in the grand scheme of solar, is the whole process of decommissioning, right? So when you give 225 permits every year, 20 years from now, in the life of all of those solar panels and 225 and growing, right? Where do they go? What happens to those solar panels? Do we have the facilities and services to take all of those decommissioned solar panels and deal with them? As you know, in Rochester, we are very familiar with waste management, the company waste management and solid waste needs and things like that. So that is something that we think about. And then in some of these commercial installs, and again, if you know Rochester, that we're kind of on an upswing now, but there has been a lot of abandoned commercial buildings. And what do you do when you have an abandoned commercial solar install 20 years from now? What happens with that? Whose responsibility? What happens when these things start falling apart? Is there contamination issues? That type of thing. So we dealt with the decommissioning issue as best we could under state law and kind of within the confines of our ordinance. But that's a segment of the ordinance that really is yet to be determined as we kind of move forward in time. So I think that wraps up my presentation and kind of where Rochester was with putting together a solar ordinance. And I'm going to pass the mic on to Sherrie.
So as Angie introduced me, I work in the siting and permitting aspects in the state. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of solar and where they're located. So just a little overview: brownfields versus greenfields, and then screening sites, and then state permits. Where I'm going with this. So siting on solar development, siting solar on brownfield sites. So from the seed perspective, and if you talk to the regulators, and even probably in your own municipalities, people like to see development where development already is. And so this is sort of the low-hanging fruit, and a lot of the solar advocates are really wanting to use our brownfield sites for solar development. This can sometimes run afoul with what the planning commission or the local planning board really wants to do, because in a lot of our communities, we're focused on revitalizing the main street and bringing jobs back to the commercial centers. And so this one, although good in theory, can sometimes run against what we're trying to do within our commercial areas. But this is a great way. I know the city of Franklin did a couple solar projects on municipally owned projects, that, you know, was just unused parking lot space that had been abandoned. And so it's a good way to get some passive income from a municipal standpoint, on some underutilized, facilities, and then just making use of the space that you have without getting into green spaces. Sometimes, you can get some grant funding associated with, you know, the redevelopment site if there's some contamination, and you can repurpose it. In this case, you know, you're not even penetrating the ground, they're just on these concrete blocks, so you can just lay them on top. Next slide, please. Landfill solar, that's really been popular. Of course, the amount of landfill space is, you know, debated in terms of what we can use and what we can't use. But that has been pretty popular for using, you know, unused space. It has some advantages in that, it's already considered impermeable, so you're not really generating additional surface water. The storm water that's generated off of that, if it's a lined, if it's a cap landfill, it's just part of that. So again, using that same sort of layout where you're not penetrating the cap, you're just laying the solar on top of it. It's quite easy to get through the system with something on a landfill. Next slide. This is another one where you're doing solar panels over the existing parking lot, and we've seen a lot of this as we start to think about integrating sustainability into our commercial and our urban spaces, making the most use out of what we have available. It's great in New England because it keeps the snow off your vehicles, and it keeps the shade on your vehicles during the summertime. We have seen some of these installs, not all that popular in New England, but those can be an interesting way, and especially now we're talking about, you know, pairing EV carports with EV chargers. So especially when we are looking at the coming future of EV chargers and how many we're going to need when we all transition to EV vehicles, and the grid being in the way, in the situation that's in, and not being able to withstand all this power that's going to be needed, provided or distributed. This could be a nice pairing with your solar and your EV chargers. Next slide. Then the other one, siting solar on former sand and gravel pit sites, that's a really good use for once you're going into the reclamation time of getting, when these sand and gravel pits are being reclaimed, thinking about using them for solar is a nice option, and there's one of that, Durham did that in Next slide, please. So screening sites. The major things that the state is concerned with, you know, in accordance with, you know, or we all should be concerned if you're building solar. First is wetlands and rare endangered species, not up there, but natural resource assessments, whether you're in the shoreline area, you're on a brownfield site, whether it's contaminated, and then interconnection. Now, Vermont has a wonderful map that you can just pull up and look at and say, oh, we can't put solar here, the grid can't handle it, but this is green, this is red, and this is green. We don't have said interconnection application yet in New Hampshire. It's been something that we've been at Clean Energy New Hampshire been pushing Eversource to make public, so people know whether their area can support the addition of additional distributed generation. Fingers crossed, we'll see that. The interconnection piece is probably the first from a technical standpoint, whether it can be added to the system, depending on the size, obviously. Wetlands and shoreline. So when the New Hampshire Department of Environmental Services was looking to do their wetlands rules rewrite a few years ago, I asked them about putting solar on wetlands and that had they considered it in their rules. They had not. They still don't. We, as VHB, we developed, in the beginning, we were doing a lot of solar on farmlands that were, you know, sort of marginal fields where they were really seasonally wet. They were like low production hay fields.
And so I even permitted full solar arrays on these old fields, which is a fantastic use because the fields were not really being productive for the farmer. Taking those fields out of agricultural production preserves the soil and is better for the environment. And then that solar install generates additional income so that the farmer can put back into the dairy farm or whatever crop that they are producing in Vermont. There's a lot of dairy. So that was a good use. And then Vermont and DEC said, no, wait, why are we putting solar there? And it was appropriately mitigated and, you know, followed all the rules. And now they have since changed those rules. Again, the DES Wetlands Bureau rules do not address solar. So right now there isn't any guidance. I was told that there was internal guidance that said, you know, you can't build wetlands, you can't build solar in wetlands, but nothing is official. So this is something that they're going through another rule sort of rewrite right now. So I'm interested to see whether they will take on that issue. I know that the alteration of terrain regulations are now going to codify some of the solar array requirements. Next slide, please. These are just a listing of online tools and resources to evaluate sites for their suitability for solar. You have your wetlands and, you know, all of your natural resource assessments, your contamination guidance documents. Next slide. This is a good resource for the best management practices for utilities, but it allows folks who may not be familiar to identify resources, and it addresses like best management practices in association with installing. So for, you know, in wetlands, the utility industry uses timber matting. So if you have a temporary wetland crossing, you're laying down these like 4 by 16 bolted together timbers that distributes the weight across the wetland. So you're not creating an impact, so that once you are done your construction, you can pick them up. So when I said I permitted solar in a wet field, that's what we use. We use those mats to get access. We they put in the racking system, put the solar panels out, and then backed out with the mats. So when the only real impact was just burying the conduit between the pole in the road and the array itself, and the rest of it was just in a field and really had no impact. BHP also did a study on whether or not the solar panels themselves and the shading of the panels impacted the vegetation composition underneath the panels, because it's obviously shaded at certain times. And after 2 years of doing that plant inventory, we found no appreciable difference between where there were solar panels and where there were not solar panels. Next slide, please. So from a local ordinance standpoint to the state level, I would kind of say that, as I said, the wetlands doesn't address it. At the core level, if you have a forested wetland and you're converting that permanently to something else, so if you're cutting down the trees to put in a solar farm, you're going to completely convert that from a forested wetland down to shrub or really an emergent grassland. So you would have to pay mitigation for the conversion. There is no such rule in the New Hampshire DES Wetlands Bureau with regard to conversion. You can cut trees within a wetland without a permit as long as you don't impact the ground. And there are other regulations around for state forestry activities, but for the most part, as long as you're hand cutting and you're not impacting, disturbing the ground, you can cut trees. So that's a factor. Within the shoreline permit application, shoreline permit, that's within 250 feet of fourth order streams or 10 acre or larger ponds. There are requirements around maintaining that 50-foot buffer to the shoreline. So if you're planning any solar in proximate to any of those water resources, you just need to be cognizant of what your shadow requirements might be in preserving that forested buffer. And then alteration of terrain, as I said, right now, AOT came out with solar guidance a couple of years ago that's sort of been circulated and in use. And now they're trying to codify what was sort of in the guidance, but with certainly better detail in terms of what they're expecting. And the alteration of terrain is really going to deal with those stormwater issues. So if you meet the trigger of 100,000 square feet of impact, if it's below that, and you're not in a shoreline area, which would be 50,000 square feet of impact, then you probably are only going to be caught up with local ordinances if you're outside of any wetland impact and outside of any shoreline area. The alteration of terrain, their main concern is stormwater. They had seen even one of our projects where in construction, we did a 2 megawatt ground mounted solar facility for a private facility. And it was supposed to be big. So 1 megawatt is about 5 acres. And it was supposed to be phased, and they did it. And they weren't supposed to remove all of the vegetation, and they did. So it was a field, it's part of a forest, and they just basically removed everything. So it was just bare soil. And then the rains came in the spring, and we had a big mud puddle. So working with the department, fixing it. One of the things that came out of that was now that they have requirements for putting in, and this is in the new proposed rules, is that they're going to require temporary stormwater channels and temporary sediment basins be in place before you start removing vegetation and doing that groundwork. So that is certainly a significant improvement. There's still requirements for phasing. I believe it's 5 acres. They're not supposed to open up more than 5 acres at any one time. But that, I think, is we also did some studies at BHB looking at the drip edge of the solar panels to see, what over time, if that creates erosion, and if it's a well-established vegetative cover, then those stormwater issues are really not present. But the real concern is during construction, making sure that the contractor's out there and controlling the stormwater while the panels are being installed. So that's really the issue that alteration of terrain is really trying to hone in on with their stormwater, making sure that during the time where it's most critical during construction, that we're actually getting enough treatment and control of that stormwater. So overall, looking at those regulations, I do believe that they are meeting the mark, and they have requirements with regard to height of the drip edge, and depending on where your slope, what your slope is for your solar array, sort of as you step up in slope, you step up in requirements. So I think that's not too restrictive in terms of what the developers are trying to achieve. And then, as Shanna mentioned, there's not a ton of local ordinances for solar. And I think each community has been trying to tackle it in their own way. We'll say Clean Energy New Hampshire does have like a model ordinance that was put together by a professor at UNH. A couple things on considering that as I was saying at the top of my presentation with regard to where you site solar, this conflict between, well, commercial should be in commercial areas sort of runs in conflict with what the developer wants to do. If they're going to do a utility scale solar, they want some big open area that's not around much else, because they're going to need a lot of land for that. So that usually falls in your rural zones, which for the most part, you don't have commercial or industrial uses in your rural zones. You don't want to see a 25 or 50 acre solar array right off your downtown, because that's not bringing people to your downtown, and that's not creating jobs. So that's something that, I feel like when we talk about local zoning ordinances, sort of runs afoul to what we typically think of industrial uses, but that's really where things are going. Because the economy of the renewable industry is so challenged in the state, there's not a lot of policy incentives. The economies of scale is really where renewables are going. So when I talk to folks, they're looking at even our local grown developers like Revision. they're looking more beyond the residential solar developments into utility scale, commercial scale solar, that because the cost of materials has gone up and inflation, they're looking to make use of the best panels they can in the largest area they can, so it's gonna generate the most profit for them. So, what I expect to see is we'll still be adopting residential solar, but if it goes the way it's gone in other states, depending, you're gonna see a lot of these like larger solar. And I think the other thing too, getting back to the safety issue, is that, I just encourage folks to remember that these are not occupied facilities. So there's really nobody there that can be injured. These things catch fire. So there was concerns that when I met with other municipalities that said, well, our building inspector doesn't know how to inspect these things. We don't know if those connections are correct. How are we going to be able to handle this influx of residential solar or commercial solar? And so my comment to that, the developer's comment to that, well, if it catches fire, let it burn. Like, there's nothing you can save out of that. Just make sure there's nobody around. It doesn't spread. Just let it burn to the ground. That was the conversation with the fire department. For these things, I mean, they only work if they work, right? They only produce profit if they work. So if they don't work, that's the problem of the owner, not necessarily the problem of the municipality, provided that, nobody's there when something goes horribly awry, but they don't explode or anything. And this isn't part of the presentation, but we're seeing a lot more of solar combined with battery storage. And that's another area where we didn't actually address that in the ordinance, but we're seeing more and more of that. Going back to the economy of scale, and it's particularly in Massachusetts, when now they have a new program where if you discharge your electricity at that peak energy rate, you get the most money. So they want to store that energy, wait for the time of day where they're going to get the most money, and then discharge it. So you're going to see a lot more, and we're seeing a lot in Massachusetts and Maine, of this combined solar with battery storage. Then that gets another issue. And most of the time you're going to see like these tractor trailer size batteries, and they just sort of sit on site. We've done foundation designs for them. There's really nothing particularly interesting about them. But that's an area where now you do have something on site that could potentially explode. So, sorry, we'll leave on that note.
Well, it's gonna be a tough act to follow. So, I am Josh Elliott, I'm the Director of the Division of Policy and Programs at the New Hampshire Department of Energy, and I'm going to talk a little bit today about various either state policy incentives or financial incentives in terms of rebates or federal funds that are available. Again, rather the state of the federal government, if your community has already made the decision, hey, we want to go ahead with solar, obviously there's a cost involved to that, and there's a couple of ways to defray the cost. So the first one, I'm sorry, I forgot a couple slides.
Oh, did I?
There we go, thank you. So the first one, this one's a pretty straightforward one. This is run by the state. It's out of our renewable energy fund. It's a rebate program up to $10,000 for commercial, industrial, solar installations, which municipalities, county school districts, et cetera, will all qualify for as that commercial industrial side. So if you fill out all the paperwork, you get it up to a $10,000 rebate. We send you a check. Everyone goes away happy. The one requirement that we do have is that you must be registered to mint what are called RECs, or renewable energy certificates. It's part of the statute, we're required to do this. So you're gonna be saying, okay, well, what the heck is a REC? What the heck is a renewable energy certificate? It's also an income stream. Essentially, think of the electricity grid this way. It's a giant pool of water. So you take a glass of water, you dump it in and say, okay, I want my glass of water, right? You can't track those individual molecules of water to get your glass of water back. The electric grid is the same way. Electrons are generated and they go to where there's the demand. You can't track and control electrons. It's just, you can't. That very basic and fundamental physics is all I do. So what has been developed instead is a way of purchasing and selling those renewable attributes in electricity called RECs. Actually, fun fact, they were actually originally conceived up here in New Hampshire. It's now a national model. Essentially, again, so it's a renewable attribute. So even though, you know, for example, I live in Rochester, there's a hydroelectric dam nearby, it's generating electricity periodically. Probably most of my electricity is either from there or my neighbor across the street who has solar panels in back their house. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm not, thank you. So that's probably where most of my electricity comes from, right? But I don't get to claim that. I can't say I'm 100% renewable electricity. I can't say I'm using it. These renewable certificates are then generated or minted by these facilities and then can be sold on the open market. So you can get an additional revenue stream after you've installed these solar systems to be able to sell these, so you get ongoing revenue going forward. Unless you want to claim that you're 100% renewable, then you can't do that. The last one, and Shanna had mentioned this, sort of alluded to this earlier, is called net metering. Essentially, you have these generation assets. Solar panels is the perfect example of this. You're generating electricity, but you may not necessarily be using all of that electricity at any given time. So today's a perfect example. Around 72 degrees, bright sunny day. You're probably going to be, depending on the size of the facility and the size of your demand, you're probably going to be exporting or generating more electricity than you're using. You flip it around and say, okay, say if today was 95 degrees and it's cloudy and it's really humid, you're running your AC, you're running a whole bunch of other equipment, you're probably not going to be exporting much electricity. This is net metering as a policy, essentially a way to even out those times. So there are going to be times when you're going to be exporting or selling electricity to the grid. There's also going to be times when you're buying electricity to the grid. And net metering as a policy essentially, kilowatt in, kilowatt out. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but that's essentially how it works. For municipalities, and this counts for counties, school districts, etc. Municipalities are allowed to net meter on facilities up to 5 megawatts, so that's a pretty substantial size facility. And this is higher than the rest of, for example, if you're really commercial industrial, it's just a 1 megawatt. But this is a way of generating sort of that extra, either that extra revenue or being able to sort of be able to monetize those extra credits if there are any extra at the end of the day or end of the year. There's also, I will point out, there's a geographic restriction currently in the statute. It functionally limits, if you wanted to sort of aggregate a bunch of demand, say a bunch of smaller towns together, you're probably not going to want to invest in a whole solar field yourself in order to cover all the demand from the town. Current statute limits it, essentially functionally limits it, that you have to be the facility where the generation is occurring, as well as all of the off-takers or the people who are using this electricity, all have to be in the same municipality. They all have to be in the same area. There's a carve-out in statute that allows just hydroelectric dams. Essentially, it's a date, if you build it before a certain date, you can, if you're up in Berlin, you can take somebody from Keene, as long as you're in the same utility service area. So if you all have Eversource, you all have Liberty Unitil, you can interchange between the two. House Bill 281, which is currently pending before the legislature. Committee conference met earlier this week. I was hoping I'd actually have news on this, but there's still to be determined. Still awaiting a final vote that will remove that restriction. So, for example, if Rochester wanted to put a 5 megawatt array up, they could have folks in Dover, in Farmington, in Barrington, all come together to sort of take all of that electricity that is generated from that one facility. Again, you get to those economies of scale, rather than having individual ones. That sort of arrangement is called proposed net metering. Essentially, you have one facility that's generating electricity, and you can basically tie together a number of electric accounts. I know the various cities and communities, you may have the lights of the ball field on a separate, behind a separate meter, and fire departments on a separate meter, and wastewater treatment plants on a separate meter. Essentially, it's a way to tie all of those together, so you only have generation at one site rather than 15 different sites. But all of that generation is all credited against all of those different units. So the next slide, many of you probably heard of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, or the BIL, also referred to as the IIJA. There are some federal funds that are available to the communities that you could use for solar. The first one I'm gonna talk about, it's a formula grant, which means you're guaranteed to get it, Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grants. Again, talking with long fund titles, EECBG. Folks who were around during ARA, and sorry for the multiple acronyms, American for Best, during 2008, 2009, the initial recovery after that. Same program that was then, additional money has been plugged into it. So the state of New Hampshire is going to be getting $1.6 million. There are direct awards to the 10 largest municipalities and 10 largest counties. So Rochester and Dover, you're each getting $76,000. Why? Dover's getting an extra $10. I have the slightest idea. It's formula based. I had nothing to do with it. And the county itself is also getting about $77,000. There are a lot of eligible uses for these funds. I know between, if you're from Dover or Rochester or Stratford County, you're worried, hey, could we do something? One of my colleagues from Dover, she's been in touch with your staff to make sure that the appropriate paperwork's been filed with USDOE, so everyone's all set. So nobody has to do anything right now. The eligible uses are very broad. You can do everything from swapping out street lights to traffic lights, swapping them to LEDs, to doing solar installations. There's a whole, they put the whole list there. They're very flexible funds, and there's a very, very long list of eligible uses. Next slide, please. So we have a couple of competitive programs that are being done at the federal level. New Hampshire Department of Energy is not running them. We don't have any involvement in them. This would be, you'll be applying directly with the US Department of Energy. First one is the energy improvement in rural or remote areas. Again, they were not snappy with titles for any of these. But there's $1 billion available nationwide. They're doing about $200 million tranches each year until 2026. Cities and towns under 10,000 are considered rural. And eligible uses do include the installation of solar. In terms of application periods, they've already done one for this year. Expect another one sometime in mid-2024. There's also this is just for public schools, but the grants for energy efficiency and renewable energy improvements in public school facilities. Again, very descriptive, but doesn't really roll off the tongue. There's $500 million available nationwide. $80 million was released last year. Remains to be seen what sort of how much they release in each given year. Public schools are the only eligible entities. So if you have school districts who are looking to do solar, this would be a great program for them. There's a variety of other uses, including energy efficiency, as the title would suggest. The next application period is going to be sometime in 2024. Most important, the next slide, yes, where you can find out more. So I'm sure these slide decks will get passed out, hopefully, at least this slide anyway. Of all the programs that I've talked about, there are links here. You can go and learn and find out more, either if it's with USDOE or here at the state. I will stay on our block grant at $1.6 million from the EECBG. We are required by federal statute to at least turn over 60% to entities that don't get a direct appropriation. So for Stratford County, as long as you're not Stratford County itself, Dover or Rochester, you'd be eligible for these funds. We are putting together a straw proposal that'll be coming out in the next couple of weeks. It'll be on our website for feedback for these smaller communities about, we want to make sure that these monies are going out to do projects that people actually want to do, rather than what I think would be a great project. You folks and your colleagues are the ones on the ground who see the municipal budgets line by line, and would then know better than I would, or anybody at the state would, about what your best use of these funds were. So that will be coming in the next couple of weeks. Again, wonderful to hear folks' feedback. We're heading in the right direction, or absolutely you guys are out of your mind why we're going to just want to do this. So one last thought, in dealing with federal funds, just a very gentle caveat. There's a whole host of compliance issues that you run into when you're dealing with federal funds. If you've been involved in other construction projects, you're probably familiar with some of these already. Build America, Buy America, or referred to as BABA, is a requirement to buy American-made or built products. Right now, for LEDs, I can safely say, because we have a project going on that has not been able to move forward, there are no American-made LEDs that comply with that right now. It is very frustrating, because we have projects, both state and a school district, trying to just do lighting projects, very easy energy efficiency projects that we can't get done because these products just do not exist. Davis-Bacon, prevailing wage are usually referred to as prevailing wages, are usually requirements for these federal dollars as well. Here in the Northeast, wages are generally high enough anyway that you're already going to meet or exceed Davis-Bacon in most circumstances. Really, the pain comes in compliance, in showing and providing all the proper documentation, paperwork, and the research and background showing that you're actually doing that. Even if you're already doing it, providing documentation to show you're doing it is difficult. Last but certainly not least, and sort of dovetailing off the citing questions, is NEPA, National Environmental Protection Policy Act, excuse me. These can be very, very rigorous reviews. Usually what comes out from the federal government is something called the bounded categories, or essentially, here's the box. If you stay inside this box, you get an expedited review, pretty straightforward, here's what it is. If you go outside that box, it gets very, very complicated very, very fast. So there are examples of, somebody saying, okay, you know what, I'm gonna try to avoid NEPA. I wanna put a solar array on a roof, it's already a disturbed site, I'm not gonna be doing anything with either soil disturbance or wetlands or anything like that, it's already developed, don't need to worry about it. If you take down one tree limb, you trigger NEPA. So it's always great to stay within those bounded categories to make sure that, okay, you can get that expedited review. And again, I'm not trying to say, oh, NEPA is terrible, no, we shouldn't do it anyway. It's just sort of, it has its value, but just to be aware of those as you're thinking of projects, your colleagues are thinking of projects, to really stay within those bounded categories. We also have state historic preservation. We're looking at a lot of old buildings, especially if you're doing roof mounted or other things, to maintain the historic character of certain buildings. That's also a consideration to make as well. So these are really not trying to be doom and gloom here, but just as people are sort of developing projects, having these in the back of your mind where, okay, maybe I'll pick this site versus that site, or this one over here versus that one over here. Will save you a lot of headache and heartache in the long run, rather than finding out after you've invested all this time and effort into one particular project to find out that you're gonna have to go through months of review at the federal level in order to get approval for your plans. So, on that happy note, I'm going to talk about tax credits. So you may be thinking, I'm going to start off with a disclaimer of Department of Energy, we are not tax experts, I cannot provide tax advice, no one in our agency can provide tax advice, consult a tax accountant or a tax attorney for actual advice. So with that being said, as part of the Inflation Reduction Act of the IRA, there are various tax credits that are available for either energy efficiency projects or for renewable energy projects. Now you'd be saying, you're talking to a bunch of planning boards. Why, we don't have to pay federal taxes. Why would anyone care? There's one particular clause in the IRA that allows for entities that don't usually file or never have to file for federal income taxes or federal business taxes or what have you, to be able to have something that's either called direct pay or elected pay. Essentially, the value of that tax credit, you have nothing to claim against it. You'll just get a check instead, which is pretty remarkable in terms of opening up these tax credits to a much wider group of entities rather than would normally be eligible for them. US Treasury has issued draft guidance as to how exactly the mechanics of this are going to work. There's going to be a Zoom briefing, which is next Thursday at 3 o'clock. The Zoom link is there. If any of you are on Elizabeth McKenna's distribution list on energy policy things, from Senator Sheen's office, it's the same link, so you're not going to two separate meetings here, but in terms of for your finance folks or to sort of understand how exactly these things are going to work, I would suggest joining that Zoom at least to learn more. So with that, on that happy note, I'm going to stop talking and let somebody else talk.
Thank you, Josh. So the panelists came up with a couple of questions that we wanted to go over. So we'll take some time on that and then we'll direct it to you all and see what you might have for those questions. So the first one is why, and this is to any and all of you, why is it important to go solar now instead of either doing nothing or investigating other renewable energy sources, geothermal, wind, et cetera?
So I can go first. So in terms of putting together the municipal ordinance, one of my first slide was how many building permits we had over a couple of years. I can tell you that if 2 years from now you come and ask me to do the same presentation, that would probably double if not triple. So from the municipal ordinance side, getting those ordinances in now, so you're kind of ahead of the game rather than having these installs with a 20-year lifespan in an area or in a location or without screening or something later on down the line would be why you want to do it now.
The cost of solar has come down dramatically over the last 10 years. It was really a luxury item, not too long ago, and the cost of solar panels, the efficiency of those panels has gone up significantly. We were just at a Clean Energy New Hampshire event, and we went to the brewery up in Sutton, Flying Goose, and they were saying that they had taken down the old panels, which were like 110 voltage, and they put in like 330. So, and that was only restricted by the fact that the racking system could only support that size, but they did 440 like on the roof. So it's amazing how much the technology has really changed and the cost of which has come down significantly.
I would just add to, well, concur with both of what the panelists have said, but there's federal money out there available too. There are a variety of incentives between the tax credits and things like that. They're not gonna last forever. I would say one important thing in sort of part of this is there's usually a long process. We talk about interconnection agreements, looking at sites and things like that. It's not something you can call up and have somebody out next week to quote one of these things up. There's a long process. You wanna make sure that they're right size. I would be remiss if I didn't take a pitch for energy efficiency of making sure that your buildings are as efficient as possible, so you can size those panels correctly to what the load of the building's actually.
So you started talking about siding, and I know you dove into it, but we'd love to go a little deeper on the siding piece. And thanks for mentioning some of the challenges and things you are addressing in Rochester. So how does it vary between a small residential installation versus a large commercial installation? And what are some of the concerns, both human and residential and natural? And you talked a little bit about the wetlands and whatnot, but what are we talking about for siding here, and what should we all consider either as you develop ordinances or you keep it within your existing regulations?
I think the realization that more of this is coming. This is not slowing down. This is not a one-time fad. This is going to keep going. There's going to be more and more of these things. You're going to see either the permits for installation. I know in talking to the utilities, just in the terms of numbers of requests for interconnections, have just gone through the roof. By interconnection, I mean basically plugging in your system to the rest of the grid. And I think between that and additional projects to move that electricity around, whether it's transmission projects, whether it's large scale or small scale transmission projects, you're going to see more of these. You're not going to see fewer of these. And it's I'm going to leave it at that.
As I said, developers are looking to create the largest system array that they can be for siting. The site evaluation committee for New Hampshire only looks at solar that's 30 megawatts or larger. So that's a pretty high threshold for net metering cap at 1 megawatt currently. So that puts a tremendous amount of burden on the state regulatory agencies and the local municipalities in terms of regulating that solar. If you think everything below 30 megawatts, or 30 megawatts is like the low side of the utility scale. I think 50 megawatts is the one that's in town, or is proposed. So big considerations. I mean, solar takes up a lot of land. We're fortunate here in New Hampshire that we're over 85% forested. We're not used to seeing area clear cut, especially clear cut for a renewable energy source. We've gone through our pains with Northern Pass and onshore wind and now solar boom. And, you know, it really comes down to what you value in your community, what you want for a sustainable future. And I know when I was talking to the city of Rochester, when we were talking about the ordinances, it's like, well, what are your goals? You know, is this something that you want to attract to your community? Is this something that you want to discourage from your community? Is this something that the city wants to take advantage of from a solar standpoint? And really understanding what you want from a planning perspective, what you want to see and where you want to see it. There's not a ton. I think the biggest impact is a visual impact. And, you know, when we're looking at some of these large facilities, generally more towards the North Country, where there's a lot more open land, it's on slopes, and it's on slopes where people can see them. And that ends up running afoul with folks who like their pristine environments. It's the same thing we went through with onshore wind. People don't like to see transmission lines, they don't like to see energy infrastructure, but I do want to reckon back to the time where nobody wanted to see cell towers either. And so we had this big boom of cell tower ordinances, and we were restricting everything around cell towers, but everybody wanted cell service, but nobody wanted to have a cell tower near them or, you know, in their town. So now we look at cell towers as being part of our landscape. And I think we really need to be cognitive of the fact that the clean energy transition has to happen for our existence. As human beings on this planet, we need to go to a cleaner environment, both for our health and the health of the planet. And this transition is coming. And so we want to make sure that we are choosing our energy sources responsibly and in the least impactful way. And so we have to really plan ahead and think about what we want to envision for ourselves so that we can get there and we don't sort of haphazard backward into it.
Yeah, I really couldn't say it much better. I mean, that's, you know, I think to kind of set the expectation as folks move forward with municipal ordinances is that you're not going to come up with the perfect ordinance, right? It is going to be a little bit of a do-si-do. There's going to be some concessions that you're going to give either the installers or the folks in your community who are going to be very nervous about these big installations. And so, you know, for the most part, the ordinances that you have adopted, and this goes across the board for any ordinance, you know, they should kind of ebb and flow with the needs of the community. So it is, you know, as you create this ordinance, just remember that this isn't something you're going to put on the books and not think about again for 20 years because the technology is changing so quickly, the perceptions are changing so quickly, the needs of the community are changing so quickly. So, you know, I think in Rochester, we adopted what we kind of needed at the time. You know, I think as we have now started to implement permits under this, we do wish we probably had talked a little bit more about kind of the, you know, as we have seen commercial residential mixed use, kind of that solar mixed use concept, like how can we integrate solar into, you know, parking areas and, you know, rooftops and other types of uses so that it isn't necessarily in the ag zone clearing 50 acres and a potential eyesore type of area. So, you know, just, you do have to kind of work with all the factors that you've got coming at you and understand that your ordinance may need to change every 5 years or so as technology changes and perceptions change. I do think that, you know, what I like to point out to people, and, you know, when people are very upset about kind of how solar looks is, if you actually stop and take a look at the existing electrical infrastructure, a telephone pole every 20 feet down the road with big ugly gray boxes and tons of wires, if you actually stop and look at that, you think to yourself, how in the world did we ever permit that to happen, right? Like these clean, kind of concise solar panels, you know, I think, again, like the cell phone towers are gonna be part of the landscape, you know, just something we'll deal with moving forward, so.
Awesome. Well, I would love to open it up, and then if we have time for one last question, but we'd love to open it up to the attendees, and it sounds like, do you want to try to see if everyone can hear you? Or do you want me to bring the mic over?
I'll stay and try to ask.
Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. This has been great. I jumped at the chance to ask a question because it was right on the heels of what you two were talking about right there, and that is the mixed use of solar panels. And is there more to add to that? I was going to add, you started talking about it, like, for example, I don't understand how the foundations work for the ground mounted solar, and if it's height above the ground really matters. But if you take an ugly use, like an auto yard or something like that, could you put them in there and still have that business operate? Can cars move around if they were up high enough? Is there any possibility of shade type plants to grow at a commercial scale? So like a nursery, a plant nursery, or any type of agriculture. Have you seen anything? Is there any possibilities that's out there that we can think about in that sort of next generation of solar regulations and solar uses at a commercial scale?
I'll just jump in real quick and just say, the answer to that is yes, right? Like you see that installed across the country in different locations. The problem is that oftentimes the entity who's coming forward with your major solar install is not the same person that's thinking through the needs of a parking lot or the needs of a commercial structure. And so it is going to have to be a collaborative process moving forward to get the solar guy, the parking lot guy, the building guy, the business guy, all in the same room to come up with a collaborative solution for that moving forward. And I think it will happen, but.
Yeah, I would agree with that statement, that it's hard to get everyone comes into it with a different expectation. Retrofitting our existing buildings is, the site goes like cars and then our existing buildings in terms of our greenhouse gases, emissions and how we can regulate or improve our energy consumption and reliance on fossil fuels, and that's one of our big challenges. Most existing buildings have their HVAC on the roof, and when they build those buildings, they weren't thinking, oh, can I put solar up here? So these things are like dotted across the top of the roof system, which makes it impossible in a lot of cases to put solar on top of the roof. With regard to height above the ground, there's really no limit unless you have an ordinance saying you can't put it higher than 10 feet. They generally like to have it 3 or 4 feet off the ground, so none of the vegetation is shading it, since they only really mow it every few months. It's not like a lawn unless someone's living there that they're mowing around it all the time. They generally and we've been encouraging them to use pollinating species, so we're getting pollinator habitat and association, so they're really not mowing so that they can keep that pollinator habitat. You can certainly still have an agricultural use around it. It just depends on what kind of, if you're, I was looking at one of these things, one of the flyers, and goats that can maintain. In general, there can be problems with things chewing on the wires if they're exposed. That could be problematic. The goats generally leave it alone because they're more interested in eating the vegetation. But squirrels and chipmunks do like to chew on those wires occasionally. But there is a possibility in the new alteration of terrain rules. It does require that the distance between the panels is at least as wide as the existing panels. So you do have these big gaps that would be between either the racking system or the individual trackers that would allow you to grow things in between. As long as it's nothing that's shading the existing, like you can put it in a berry field, like strawberries, blueberries, anything that would be a little bit closer to the ground.
I'll just add briefly, US DOE and USDA, there's a number of funding programs made available in the last 2 bills to basically do pilot programs with small scale farmers to figure out, okay, what's the best kind of crops to grow with these panels we have out in the field. It's great, it's a great mix, especially if they go through small farms in New England, where they're really, really on margins in terms of succeeding or failing. And to be able to add this revenue stream along, so keeping that land in agricultural use, they're trying to, it's a delicate balance, but they're funding and grant opportunities to figure out sort of the best way to do that.
That's great. Other questions? Sorry. Okay.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. My question is really twofold. One is if you could comment on the current, I say goal, for lack of a better word, community power that's sort of sweeping, particularly the southern tier of the state. And the other is that my town of Barrington has just started their own energy committee. If you have any early words of advice for that committee as they start to get their wings feathered out, and we're on fire with that.
So on community power, for those who don't know, community power is essentially a way of an entire community aggregating the power demand of an entire community and either joining with other communities or going out themselves to procure electricity. The idea of you would be potentially able to get cheaper rates than your regular default service would be your Eversource, probably all of Eversource for this county, maybe the co-op, but We're still, a lot of these things are still up and running, they're still sort of getting put together. I know Clifton Velo, who used to be Public Utilities Commissioner, Barrett, who was running the organization behind Community Power, very knowledgeable, knows more. Anytime I talk to them on the phone, it's usually me listening for about 10 minutes. Great guy, wealth of knowledge. We're still sort of in the early stages of seeing how all that pans out, but it provides a lot more. It's sort of a double-edged sword. On one hand, if the community decides, hey, you know what, we want to have a requirement of 100% renewable electricity, right? You can do that. They can do that if they so choose to, and then it's the default for anybody who's in the community. The flip side of that is then you have your local officials who are all of a sudden, in addition, responsible for your property taxes, are now responsible for your electricity rates, right? If your electricity rate is higher than somewhere else, select board members are certainly going to hear about it. We've heard at least just sort of anecdotally from folks of where they don't like the opt-out requirement, they would rather have a choice to opt in, but again, it's hard to say. A couple of folks complaining doesn't necessarily mean everybody's actually has the same issue. Regarding energy committees, love to hear it. I want to get your contact information because we have a distribution list that we're sending out. Again, all the sort of the renewable programs and things like that, federal funding opportunities to make sure that all the local communities are aware of that. So I'll give you my card before I go.
Excellent. I'll leave the community power one, but for the energy committee, I encourage you to reach out to Clean Energy New Hampshire. We have circuit riders now that we've been putting in, and we have one in Seacoast. And they can be great resources to connect the committee with potential grant opportunities, help you work through putting proposals together and connect you with the right resources. Low-hanging fruit first. Small amount of organization, getting an energy audit of the municipal buildings and seeing sort of what is your energy consumption and then where can you have biggest impact. And usually it's on that energy efficiency side first, before looking at something like a solar panel array or something that's going to require some sort of upfront investment. Although there's a lot of communities that have been able to do solar by not putting any money upfront and doing the lease option or have no cost to them. So there's a lot of options there. There's a lot of great guidance that that you can get from Clean Energy New Hampshire. And also please go to the local energy solutions conference that Clean Energy hosts in the fall. That's a great resource to meet with the other energy committees and learn from them.
And then just a little piece of kind of fundamental advice on putting that energy committee together. So New Hampshire's a very purple state, right? And sometimes these energy issues can be political. And so you want to pull that energy committee not necessarily together on some of those fundamental big picture issues that are going to separate the room into the political factions, but really pull them together for what's best for the community, and oftentimes that comes down to dollar. So a lot of the initial focus of the energy committee, really to make them as successful as possible right out of the gate, is to monetize that change over to more renewable energies, and show the community kind of how much that they are going to save in energy costs. The energy audit, 100%, I think, of the energy committees I've been involved in, that's where they start, is that community energy audit, and then change over to more energy efficiency and renewable energies and things like that, and the cost savings goal. Once they kind of folks see how easy it is and how kind of a non-issue it is, right? That it's not going to change them fundamentally as a human being to have solar. then that energy committee really starts rolling, and you can really get into some more fundamental changes.
Thank you.
Just one more. Yeah.
Mark Richardson, and this is coming to you from a recycler point of view, okay? We're all in recycling world, which was my career for a number of years. We're all seeing 20, 25-year-old solar panels. One of the big words up there, kind of cool at the beginning, was decommissioning. We're starting to see those come back in and people wanting to recycle them. That world is not completely there yet. A good friend of mine in Vermont is working very hard to get those things going. Where do you see recycling of these materials now that they're beginning to blossom and we're seeing them everywhere? Looking down the road, 10, 20 years from now, where is that recycling world going to be in your mind? Will you be here 5, 10 years from now saying, now that we've done all this, here's the answer to recycling them? Because that question is out there now. People are trying to follow the electronics recycling model and returning materials to the manufacturers for their responsibility. So where are you looking at that down the road?
What I can tell you, from the discussions that we had with our ordinance is that it's not out there yet, right? It is a struggle. It's something that we didn't have an answer to. But I can tell you, that, you know, the youth out there are bright and something's coming, right? So, keep your eyes peeled because I think there's gonna be a brilliant solution one of these days.
One of her board members, I'm thinking Energy New Hampshire, is Steve Worthen, and Worthen Industries is actually making a 100% recyclable backing to the solar panels right now. So it's not the full solar panels, but they have a European client that, as part of that their commitment as a company, they're looking for that. So I think as we move to a sustainable future, maybe we aren't pushing that in New Hampshire, but New Hampshire manufacturers are in the forefront of figuring out where we can recycle. And so for that, I was saying that, you know, we are working on it. It's definitely a necessity. We see it in the wind industry as well. We don't want to put a bunch of trash out in nature that we have to deal with at some point. So, and also just because we live in an environment of scarce resources, I just believe that we'll be mining landfills before we know it.
I agree on that last comment. There's been a couple of attempts by the legislature to look at this, and it's usually you get that tension of, okay, like extended manufacturer responsibility, right? They should be able to take these solar panels back, be able to, or whether it's that or any other product for that matter, and be able to recycle it or somehow deal with the waste. There's a little bit of a tension there. On the one hand, you may have the installers and developers and the manufacturers saying, well, why are you just telling us to do this and not, you know, car manufacturers and, you know, light bulb manufacturers, et cetera, et cetera. So there's sometimes it's viewed with skepticism as though it's a way to squelch any development in solar, but it's right. You have these, you know, complex. Sometimes they're, depending on the makeup of them, there's a lot of components that go into them, and I'm not an installer or developer, so I can't speak to specific components, but there is a question, you know, we're just talking in general about solid waste and how you deal with those products and what you deal with them. But given I think they're sort of like cell phones. At some point, you're going to see these things in street phones in the Walmart cart, or you can just throw your old cell phone in and they'll give you money back. There's all those sort of valuable resources that are in that solar panel. It's still even not worth it to use it to generate electricity. All the components certainly have value. There'll be that innovation. There'll be somebody who will come up with that brilliant idea of how to recycle these. And we'll like, oh, that makes complete sense. Why didn't anyone think of that sooner? So maybe that's just the eternal optimist.
Awesome. Well, with that optimism, we will thank our panel. Thank you to Shanna and Sherrie and Josh for being our panelists today on solar. I do have their contact information up here. We will make this presentation available. I'm not sure how yet. I'll work with Jen and the team on that. But thank you for all the great questions, and hopefully they'll stick around after the awards so you can have a chat with them. So thanks again to your panelists.
Okay, so before we move on to the award section of our agenda here this afternoon, I just want to call on someone in the audience. Katrin, could you stand up and say hello to everyone? So Katrin not only is a commissioner from the town of Lee, but she is the energy circuit rider for our region. Katrin works for Clean Energy New Hampshire and is available to help your community navigate some of these conversations. And she has cards here. So please make sure you stop by and say hello to Katrin after we're done here this afternoon. And I know we may have had a few more questions out there for our panelists. Please feel free to stick around after the awards section. I would definitely like the commissioners and staff to stick around so we can take our annual photos together. Very important. Okay, so with that, we'd like to move on to the awards section of the agenda. Each year, we like to take a moment to recognize different individuals and organizations within the region that have helped contribute to our mission as a planning commission, or building the profession of planning here in New Hampshire and the region. So the first recognition we'd like to make is to Mary Friedman, who is a professor at UNH in the planning program. Mary is retiring this year. So wanted to take a moment to recognize her. She is at a family reunion and traveling right now, enjoying that school is out of session and she is about to retire. So we have been very, very fortunate to have Mary and UNH in our region. It's been a great opportunity to connect with the students within the school, and also for staff development within our own office. So we have on a number of times partnered with Mary's capstone class of planning students who are usually in their junior or senior year, to help provide them with an opportunity for some hands-on learning experience. They have facilitated our organizational strategic planning sessions that we did about 5 years ago. They've also served as facilitators and researchers, part of our Communities for Healthy Aging Transitions project. So really great opportunity to connect. We've had staff from our office who've also gone and met with her students each year in class to present and share what it means to be a planner. But I think more importantly here to mention is the conformative role that Mary has had on the planning profession. She used to be a staff planner at SRPC and went into planning because she saw the need to grow the profession. We needed more planners out here in New Hampshire, and she especially saw the need for more women in planning. And I'm very excited to see how many women we do have here today. So definitely showing that there's been some growth and some progress there. So reached out to a handful of her staff, her former students and one current student, who shared a few thoughts that I'd just like to share. Cassie, who's one of her former students, shared that she wouldn't be here where she is today if it weren't for Mary, who was a role model, especially as a young woman beginning her career, and grateful for her knowledge and support through college and beyond. Steph Casella, who many of you might know, who used to work at SRPC and is now one of the planners in Portsmouth. Steph shared that Mary's dedication and passion for all things planning complements her natural ability to guide and instruct as she nurtures young planners from school to the real world. She sees the promise in all of her students, even when they don't see it in themselves, and is willing to go the extra mile to ensure they have the opportunity for success. A couple of months after Steph graduated from UNH, Mary sent her a text that included a link to an internship posting at SRPC with the words, "You should really apply." She did. And as Steph said, it was the best thing she ever did. What started as a 6-month internship turned into a career, and she hasn't looked back once. Autumn, on our own staff here, shared that thorough gratitude for Mary's guidance and support throughout her academic career at UNH. Mary's approach to teaching the planning process showed her how her interest in sustainability principles could translate into action and effect change through the planning profession. Seconding Steph's comments, Autumn noted that Mary's dedication to connecting students with the local community has led her directly to where she is today, and is eternally grateful for Mary helping to facilitate and launch her career at SRPC. And Troy, who is our current intern, and is going into her senior year at UNH, pardon me. Troy originally got into planning because of Mary.
since you get being here, a lot of folks go into UNH, meet Mary, and go into the planning program.
Mary helped show him the impact that planning could make on communities and just how wide the field is. She facilitated a community of planners at UNH, which helped bring students together to discuss the ways we could make local impact at UNH and get connected to staff, consistently alerting students to opportunities to get into planning outside of the classroom. Mary inspired Troy to get involved with Student Senate and to apply and eventually work at SRPC. So we'd just like to give a round of applause to Mary, who we are actually recording this to send it to her because she really wanted to be here. Just a round of applause for Mary and her thanks for everything. We'll miss her at UNH, but we really are looking forward to the hiring process and her new replacement and continuing to collaborate with UNH. Okay. Our next recognition, we've got a little theme here with our strategic plan going on. Our next recognition, we want to acknowledge two organizations who have been really helpful to SRPC as we've worked to implement one of the key goals in our strategic plan. As I mentioned 5 years ago, we went through this process. It was an organizational plan trying to identify where and how we wanted to proceed in the future. And one of the goals that came out of that was to try and expand some of the environmental and climate change related planning that we were doing with our coastal communities, which is only 5 out of 18 communities in the region, to reach that greater SRPC region. And so want to recognize here today, PrEP, the Piscataqua Region Estuaries Program, and Sea Grant, who have been really instrumental in helping us to achieve that goal within our strategic plan. So PrEP, using a coastal watershed approach, particularly through a collaboration on the Path to Resilience project that concluded in the summer of 2022, provided the means to conduct meaningful work throughout the whole SRPC region. Together, the outreach staff at both PrEP, Sea Grant, and SRPC have collaborated to protect water quality, mitigate flood risk, and ensure all voices are heard in the planning process. I further want to acknowledge Sea Grant for establishing the Coastwise Professional Development Program. It has been really a foundational opportunity for us as an organization. We have now had staff participate in 2 out of the 3 rounds of that program. And losing my place, I'm sorry. So next, I think I wanted to call up Autumn, who is going to share a little bit more. As I mentioned, Autumn's one of Mary's former students, but has been working hand in hand with the folks at both PrEP and Sea Grant. So I'll let you kind of come here. Did you watch your notes? Yes. There you go.
I'm not as eloquent as Jen, and I did not memorize my little speech, so I'm going to read off for you. I can't thank the folks at PrEP and Sea Grant enough for all the work that they've helped SRPC to produce over the last 2 years that I've been here, and obviously much beyond that. I'm really impressed by their dedication to demonstrating their commitment to workforce development and just coastal management in general, and the guidance and mentorship that they provide to their collaborators and partners. I recently completed the Coastwise program guided by Lindsay Williams and Lisa Wise, and I'm really grateful to have gained that formative training in coastal resource management. SRPC has partnered with PrEP and Sea Grant many times over the last few years, and they bring in expertise in academia, the knowledge of best available science, and equitable engagement strategies that have elevated our work product significantly. Special thanks to the hard work done by Abigail Lyon and Palamazzo at PrEP for organizing the State of Our Estuaries Conference this year. It was a great time, and there are some products from that conference in the back if you'd like to learn about our estuaries. And I've been fortunate enough to see Abigail, Lisa, and Lindsay translate their skills to practice over the course of many projects. And I'm thrilled to commence our fiscal year 24 collaborations next month.
All right, so Lisa, Colin, you wanna come on up?
Thank you. Nice to see you.
I know. I was making.
Okay.
Thank you. Projector.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Did you guys want to say anything?
Probably not.
Okay, well, I just want to thank SRPC for this recognition on behalf of me and Chrissy Grant. It's been such a pleasure working with SRPC staff over my 6 or 7 years with the organization now, and I know my predecessors as well. And I'm always looking to do projects in the SRPC region because they're such great collaborators, and really appreciate this recognition. So thank you.
I'm really here representing Abigail Lyon, who works so closely with SRPC. My name is Colin Monso, by the way. And those of you who know Abigail Lyon know that she is just a remarkable person. And what I've always been struck, what has always struck me is how highly she speaks about SRPC. And when you know somebody like Abigail, that's just gold, you know. You're just like, wow. If somebody as amazing as Abigail is speaking like this about SRPC, it's just a fantastic resource, and we're so grateful. Trefry is so grateful to have an organization like SRPC in the watershed, because we're just 5 people, and we rely on strong partnerships to do our work. So thank you to all of you at SRPC and everybody in this room for helping us to make our watershed as healthy as it can be.
Well, thank you. That's all we have today. We're very grateful that you could join us here today. Here's to another great year of planning in the region. Feel free to stick around for a few minutes, chit chat, and have some coffee and water still. And we'll make sure we get those photos in before everyone runs away. Thank you.